Thank you, Rob. Again, my name is Bob Patterson, and I'm the Vice President of College Outreach here at Zinch. Again, I've spent about 16 years in higher education, most recently as the Director of Admission at Stanford. Prior to that, I was the Deputy Director of Admission at UC Berkeley. Before that, I was at UNC Chapel Hill. Before that, I was at the University of Pittsburgh, and before that, I was actually at the University of Pittsburgh at Bradford, a regional campus of the University of Pittsburgh. And throughout my 16 years, I've done a lot of outreach with high school counselors as well as with teachers and students about preparing successful applications. One of the topics that's rarely talked about is really how to write an effective teacher recommendation or a letter of support for the student. Many teachers are asked to do this throughout the year. Many teachers are never really trained throughout their entire teaching training to really talk about a letter of support or a letter of recommendation. But as many of you know on the call today, many of you are asked this multiple times throughout the year for juniors, for seniors, for other types of programs, whether it's scholarship programs, study abroad programs, gap year programs, you name it, I'm sure you're being asked to write a letter of support for students. And many really ask the question, is it really evaluated? Do the admissions office, do they really read the letters of support for students? And the answer to that is really yes. It becomes a very critical component of the institution when they are asking for that letter of support. And so today we're really going to be talking about the different ways in which you can enhance the letter of support or the teacher recommendation so that the students really have the best opportunity to be successful in the admissions process. At the end of the day, if Pittsburgh, the teacher recommendation really was a key factor for students for the honors program and for scholarship consideration. Likewise, when I was at UNC Chapel Hill, it was used for scholarship for the honors program, and then really it was really heavily used for out-of-state students applying to UNC Chapel Hill for admissions consideration. At Berkeley, it was not considered as part of the application because teacher recommendations were not something that students could submit with their application. However, students, about 5 to 8% of the students who applied to Berkeley went through a process called augmented review. And that's when something in the application, the admissions committee really flagged and they wanted to know a little bit more about the student. And at that point in time, they would ask for 2 letters of support from teachers, from community leaders that could really add to the conversation for the student. And then when I was at Stanford, teacher recommendations were definitely something that were a critical component of the application process. At Stanford, the admit rate was around 6%. A lot of the students had very strong academic credentials. They had very strong SAT scores, ACT scores, TOEFL scores. They were doing a lot of things outside of the classroom, and that teacher recommendation just added that additional layer of academic support for the student during the admission process. To the point that we would highlight different pieces of the teacher recommendation, and then those would be discussed during a application review committee, which I chaired, and we would have the admission officer would discuss the application, would talk about the student, but then would also say, and this is what the teachers are saying about them in their school. And so that became part of the conversation, and as the committee voted, those things that the teacher would write would be discussed, and that would be a part of that vote whether or not to admit the student. So it is a very valuable piece of the application process, and as I said, at all different types of institutions. And so with that, I'm going to turn this over to David Meredith, and he's going to introduce himself a little bit more and then really walk you through on the important part. As Dave is currently in higher education, I left higher education to join Zinch really to do these types of programs with webinars for students, webinars for teachers, webinars for counselors, because I felt like I could have a much broader reach. So hopefully this is going to be helpful for you, and I'll be back at the end of the presentation to answer any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Bob, and thank you everybody for taking time out of your day to join us. As Bob said, I've been in higher education for quite a while, I guess 20-some years, in a variety of settings, from honors program, University University of Cincinnati, undergraduate admissions at UNC Chapel Hill, where I worked alongside Bob, and now at the University of New Orleans, where we have admissions and financial aid and a lot of different areas working together. And I just want to echo what Bob said about the recommendation letters, and we get this question all the time, do you really read these things? And I can't stress enough that we do. They are a very important part of our review. And I guess somebody once said, and I wish I could remember who told me this, that colleges aren't looking to admit a transcript, they're looking to admit a person. And the person really comes through in the recommendation letter. So the time that you take, I know the long nights and agonizing over phrases and words, you wonder, is this all worth it? From an admissions standpoint, it's very much worth it because there's only so much you can glean from a test score, from a transcript, or from a list of extracurriculars. What we're really trying to figure out is what is the student going to be like in our classroom? Will our professors enjoy having them in the class, and will our students benefit from having that student sitting next to them asking questions and working on projects? So recommendation letters are a key part of how colleges are looking at students. And so I kind of want to walk through a couple of slides here, just kind of a quick presentation we developed that might help counselors and teachers navigate this whole process. So the first thing I want to talk about is considering developing a how-to guide for students. Just the same way that Bob mentioned that teachers and counselors never receive formal training on how to write recommendation letters, students have no idea how to ask for recommendation letters. I almost wish I had you in an audience. I could see how many people raised your hand to this question. How many of you have been asked, Mr. Smith, Mrs. Jones, will you please write me a recommendation letter? Sure, when is it due? Tomorrow. How many hands are up at that point? I'm sure many of them. This guide can really help students think through how they go about asking for a recommendation. It can be a quick one-pager, really just more of a highlight, reinforcing the idea of deadlines and timelines and not asking for recommendation letters the day before they're due. It might also include a section where students can put their key highlights in. If you are like any teacher that I know, you have many, many students, and sometimes students will come back to junior teachers, junior year teachers asking for recommendation letters, and that little bit of a bio, what class I had you in, what do you think you contributed to that class, what special things would you like me to focus on, what is this recommendation letter for? Bob mentioned that sometimes students don't quite understand the difference between an admissions recommendation letter versus a scholarship recommendation letter or a special opportunities recommendation letter, and this can help the student organize their thoughts and their requests, and then in turn help the staff better understand what they're writing for. I've talked to a couple of schools that have implemented this, and the teachers all report that once this kind of gets settled into the culture, their lives become a lot better because the students have an idea of how to approach asking, rather than walking down the hall between class periods and shouting out, Mr. Meredith, will you write me a recommendation letter to go to XYZ school? Thanks, see you tomorrow. A more formal way to request that submission. It may also include information about deadlines, addresses of where to send the recommendation letter. It allows the students, again, it puts a little more responsibility on the students, but it allows them to be a little more organized in that process. Second slide, Bob. Stick to what you know. This is a hard thing for a lot of teachers to know what to put in the recommendation letter. If you've had that student in class, you know what they're like in class. If you're an advisor for a club or a sport, then you know them in that regard. That's what we want to hear about. The same way that we would not expect the advisor for Habitat for Humanity to write about how the student is in calculus class, we don't expect a calculus teacher to recite all the various extracurriculars that the student is involved in. Most colleges, at least most admissions offices, if they're asking for a recommendation letter, they have another section of the application that asks for extracurriculars and other things that the student might be involved in. So there's no need to recite a laundry list of what that student's involved in. We're going to get that in another part of the application. Keep the application to what you know that student, how you know that student. If the student is in your class, that's what you should focus on. If you know the student because she or he is in a club that you advise, focus on that. You don't need to step outside your area of knowledge and try to encompass everything that student might have done in that high school. Next slide, Bob. Focus on specifics. This is one of the key ways that teachers can really help that letter of recommendation become more than just another letter of recommendation. If you've done any sort of role-playing with your local admissions offices, there's a couple of exercises we used to do at UNC Chapel Hill where we would put guidance counselors in sort of mock committees and give them actual redacted applications and have them make decisions to see how we go through our thought process. And a lot of times they would read the recommendation letters and say, well, geez, this says nothing. There's really nothing in this recommendation letter. The more you can focus on specifics, the better. For example, there's an example I'll give you. Here's one line from a recommendation letter. Steve has been one of the best students I've ever taught at Leesville Road High School. That would be one version of that sentence. Here's another version of that sentence. Steve is one of the best students I've taught at Leesville Road High School because he isn't afraid to wrestle with challenging concepts. Now, if you were an admissions officer and you were reading that recommendation letter, which of those two sentences gives you a better idea of what Steve's like? Sure, you know that he's one of the best students, but we don't know what you know. Why are you saying that about Steve? So the more detailed, the more specific examples you can give, the better off. Which leads me to the next slide, examples. There's a lot of catchphrases now in recommendation letters, things like love of learning, thirst for knowledge, Renaissance woman or Renaissance man. Those they're boilerplate anymore, they're catchphrases, and they don't really distinguish that recommendation letter from any other recommendation letter. Why is Johnny or Sally a Renaissance person? How does that student demonstrate their thirst for knowledge? Tell us a story. I always love reading recommendation letters that were more of a story. About a time when Johnny, the class discussion was stagnant, students weren't really into it, it was right before a break, and Johnny asked a question that really galvanized the discussion in the classroom. That's an example we can focus on when we're in committee, when we're making an argument of why to admit a student. We can say, here's a concrete example of how this student's going to contribute to our classroom. Or if it's an extracurricular recommendation letter you're writing, how did that student's participation in that activity change? For example, one might say, the club had 10 students in it, and we sort of really had no focus. Once Sally joined the club, the enrollment doubled, and now it's the most active, engaged organization on our campus. Giving those specific examples really helps the admissions staff or whoever, the scholarship committee, looking at that particular recommendation letter, understand what that student is about and how they're going to contribute. So again, you know the student. We don't. All we know about them at that point is what their transcript says, what courses they took, what grades they earned, what their ACT or SAT, and what you're allowing the admissions committee or the scholarship committee to do is sort of flesh that out into a three-dimensional, living, breathing human being. Up until that point, the student is not a living, breathing human being. So if you can sort of approach your recommendation letter as that is your challenge to make that person a person to us, that might help you think about specific examples. Next slide, Bob. Honesty is the best policy here. If the student approaches you and you just don't remember them in class or they weren't that dynamic in your memory, you're better off being honest with them and then helping redirect them to somebody else who might know them better. They may have just really liked you, and you might have just gotten along with them on a social level, but maybe not any more in depth to be able to write about their achievements in the class or in the extracurricular organization. Being honest with them up front is going to be the best policy, but then also then helping them redirect that request to somebody who maybe is a little more appropriate to write. Also, I know that what happens is the most popular teachers get the most requests because everybody likes you. And that's a good thing, but what happens, I think, sometimes is they get students request so many recommendation letters from the same people that those folks get overwhelmed. I was talking with a colleague last night, and he read me a segment of a recommendation letter, and it went something like this. I don't remember the exact names, but it goes something like this. This student, we'll call her Susan. Susan is a great student in my class. He is a delightful person to have in the classroom because he does this, this, and this. Mark, it would be a great addition to your school. So you've got three issues there. You've got the student with two names and two genders. And what happens then is that letter just becomes meaningless to the recommendation committee or to the admissions committee or to the scholarship committee because we don't know exactly to know, do we believe this? Who is this person writing about? And I know what happens is you're overwhelmed. You've got a lot of folks you're trying to write for, and it just becomes a little bit of a detail game. Now, one of my favorite ones was we would get recommendation letters at UNC Chapel Hill where the recommendation was solid. It was well written and full of details and full of examples. And at the last paragraph would say, and that is why I strongly recommend Johnny to be a member of the class of whatever at Princeton University. And we would always get a chuckle over that, or insert some other university. I know my colleagues there would never penalize the student for that, with the theory being, what would you say differently about the student if they're applying to UNC Chapel Hill versus Princeton or any other school? But when we see things like pronoun issues or you're calling a student by the wrong name, we really start to have to think, is this really a recommendation letter, or is this some sort of a form that the teacher keeps on their desktop and they just sort of find and replace? They just forgot to find and replace this one particular thing. So be honest with the student. If you're just overwhelmed and you can't possibly say yes to another person, then redirect them to somebody who will be able to help them more with more time and more effort towards that recommendation letter. Length, the same way that teachers don't like to read fluff essays, and some of you are probably chuckling at that, admissions offices don't need to read a lot of fluff. If the recommendation letter really is only going to be a page, stretching it onto a page and a half is really not going to add anything. So length does not equal quality. The same way with most student essays, length does not always equal quality. I have a colleague, a friend of mine, who works at a school where their school policy was that all recommendation letters had to be 2 pages. And we used to joke with her that we were able to see when the actual recommendation letter stopped and when the necessary, I got to get to 2 pages started. So again, there's no need for that, unless your school has that policy, and hopefully they don't. But keep it to what you need to put in there. If it really is only a page long or even a couple paragraphs long, if it's a couple powerful paragraphs, that's much more impactful than 5 or 6 fluff paragraphs where we're really not learning anything about the student. Lastly, focus on the student. Every once in a while I'll read a recommendation letter that almost sounds like the teacher's resume. I've been teaching for so many years. I've won these awards. I graduated from these prestigious universities. And I don't know whether they think that means that their recommendation letter should carry more weight than someone who's only been teaching for a couple of years, maybe graduated from a less prestigious university, hasn't won a slew of awards. I don't know what the motivation is there. Admissions people are generally trusting souls. We tend to kind of just go with what we see, and you don't need to spend the first paragraph impressing us. The fact that you took the time out of your day or night or weekend to write the recommendation letter, that's enough for us. So get to the student. Now, the only time I think there might be an exception to this is sometimes I'll read a recommendation that says, I've been teaching for 23 years, and Sally is by far the best student I've ever had. That's a little bit more of a contextual example then. So out of 20-some years, Sally is the best. Or you might say the exact opposite. I've only been teaching for a couple years, and I certainly hope I get more students like Mike. that in that case, then that context does matter, or it can be impactful. But just simply telling us all of your achievements and accomplishments isn't going to really make your letter stand out any more than a letter written from any other person. We know your time is valuable. If you think Jill or Johnny is a great student and can give us the examples why, we're going to believe you. Spend your effort focusing on the student. And then lastly, ask questions. What is this recommendation letter going to be used for? As we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of different groups now that look for recommendation letters or letters of support. Admissions, scholarships, honors programs. There might be special opportunities available to certain students on campuses that are only available to certain, to select individuals. So finding out from the student, and this might go back to the very first thing we talked about, this how to write a how to ask for a recommendation form, might go in there. Where the student might say, well, you know, I don't know where the letter's going towards. Then that student might be prompted to go find out, which might allow you to tailor your letter a little more directly. If it's an opportunity for a female student to become involved in a mentoring program for budding scientists, for example, then you'll review for an admissions application, you might focus more on just how is the student in your classroom. So again, asking what the recommendation letter is going to be used for will really help the student figure out that information and then help you direct your comments more towards that. And I just want to go back to one of the first things I said is student or colleges and opportunities that are looking for recommendation letters are really trying to admit or select or identify students, not transcripts. I had a question once from a counselor friend who said, you know, Dave, this student's our #1 student in the class. She's done everything that you could possibly do. You can see it in her application. Had 9 AP courses. She's got an ACT score through the roof. She's the president of everything. We've got that. You're right. We don't need to see any more. But what the recommendation letter allows us to do is to decide, is that student worthy or qualified for some of our other things? And the other flip side of that, and I guess it's just a part of the burden that admissions offices bear, is the selectivity rates. Bob mentioned the selectivity rate in the single digits. And so everybody applying to Stanford has great ACT scores, great transcripts, and is the president of everything. What makes that student different than the other 3,000 students who have the exact same credentials? So don't fall into the assumption that the admissions office or the selection committee is going to see all these great numbers, and so why wouldn't they select this student? You know, it's the reality in admissions these days that selectivity rates are going up, admit rates are going down, and admissions offices are really struggling to try to figure out a way to differentiate amongst a unbelievably talented applicant pool. And your words and your insights into these students are what really allows us to make those fine line distinctions. And so, again, they are read, I promise you. And they are a very valuable part, as evidenced by the fact there are 158 of you on this webinar right now. So that kind of concludes my comments about recommendation letters or letters of support, and I'm more than willing to answer questions that folks might have.
All right, great. Thank you, Dave. So we have a number of questions here. I'm going to start off with the one that's been the most common. We've had a few people ask, you know, hey, I'm a counselor, college advisor at a school where my caseload is, you know, in the hundreds of students. And many students approach me, ask for a letter of recommendation, and I really know nothing about them or have no idea who they are. So in those instances, what's the best approach to learn about the student, write a letter about them? Someone asked about, is it best to be honest and say, you know, I really, you know, basically kind of give the framework of the school and how many students I have and kind of put it in context and then talk about the student with what you know, get a brag sheet from the student or get information and base your letter on that. What sort of approach do you recommend, Dave?
Bob, did you want to start or do you want me to take that one?
You You can start, and then I'll add to the conversation.
Yeah, I think being honest might be the best policy, but if the student doesn't know a teacher well enough to ask that question, then soliciting, like you mentioned, a brag sheet. What would you like me to say about you? If you were me, sort of flip the tables on the student, what would you like me to write about? Is it about your unbelievable academic achievements? Is it your extracurricular involvement? And get them thinking about, oh, maybe this might not be the best person. They might just know you the best because you're their counselor and they might spend more time with you. But that redirection. Well, let me ask you a question, student, Sally. What's this recommendation letter for? And let's think about who might be able to write you the best recommendation letter. Theoretically, you might have some access to their schedule to know, oh, you took Mr. Jones for American History last year. I know he's a good writer. How'd you do in that class? Did you like that class? And maybe redirect that back towards someone who might know that student a little bit better. At the end, I have read recommendation letters where it's more of a perfunctory. Here's the student, I'm the advisor or the counselor. I don't know a whole lot about them, but here's what I can tell you. And they're just honest. And you know, that's what it is. And at large public schools, that's often the reality. And so we don't hold that against a student if they happen to go to that kind of a school. It's not their fault. So we're not going to hold that against the student.
Sure, and I'll just add to that a story that I had when I was at Stanford. I read a very few number of applications compared to the admission officers. I read somewhere between 800 to 1,000. Had very specific territories that I wanted to read because I felt passionate about the students in these particular areas. And one of the school districts I read was LA Unified School District. And 3 years ago, LA Unified School District laid off 238 counselors because they wanted their course load to go from 500 to 1 to 1,000 to 1. And when you think about that, you think that, you know, how in the world would a counselor be able to know all the students that are applying to universities? And the answer is it's not going to happen. What I would see from a number of counselor letters of recommendation at Stanford, it would basically say, I don't know the student, see teacher rec. And while I think that's great, it's being honest, a little bit more context would be helpful there. Why don't you know the student? Well, it's because we're dealing with 1,000 to 1 course load. There's no way I could know every single student. But as Dave said, if there's a way you can get that brag sheet, is there a way that I know some counselors will go to teachers and just ask different questions and try to add that into the recommendation letter just to provide a little bit more detail than I just don't know the student, see the teacher recommendation? Because the chances are the teacher may not know that student very well either if they have a class of 50 students and they're teaching multiple sections, unless it's a really standout student. And in that case, you know, it would be helpful and hopeful that they would know a student that's applying to a place like Stanford, for example, where it's generally students who are top flyers that are really well known in their school. That sort of support would be very helpful. So again, as Dave said, it's not something that's going to be taken against the student. It is something that the admission office doesn't have when they're going into the discussion if it is going to be a selective school where there are committees that are making those decisions. Because one of the questions I would always ask when I was chairing the committee, I would say, what did the counselor say about the student? And if the person coming back said, well, the counselor said they didn't know him, goes to the teacher, it doesn't really give me much when I'm trying to differentiate between really quality students applying to any institution. But if I was able to come back and say, well, the counselor doesn't really know the student, they're dealing with a course load of 1,000 students, they very rarely interact with students. Maybe they're lucky to interact on a total of 15 to 20 minutes a year, and that includes a parent night that they have. That gives me additional context about the school. If it's the counselor and they want to talk a little bit more about the school as well, that would be helpful. So the letters of support not only don't have to be about the student. If you're in one of these large school districts, you know, I know in California the average student to counselor ratio is over 600 to 1. And so that's going to be a lot of cases where that's going to happen. So any types of context would be helpful in that process.
And we had one counselor note that they put 2 sentences at the top of each letter of recommendation with the caseload and how long they've been in counseling and counseling that student, just to provide some context. Now, just kind of on topic or kind of in a similar vein, we have a question or a statement kind of saying, Common App strongly urges a counselor to write comments about every student. If a student does not have a good relationship with a counselor or does not know them, isn't this a disadvantage to the student when other students from smaller schools receive a detailed counselor recommendation? Dave, can you comment on that?
Well, like you just said, it's just something we don't have. It's not necessarily a negative. It's just a missing piece to that puzzle. But I think going back to the couple of comments that both Bob and I have made is that the more you can redirect that student to somebody who can write about them. It might be a teacher. It might be what club they're in. It might be somebody even outside of the school. If they're active, maybe in some sort of a civic group or something, maybe with their church or religious organization. Again, somebody knows that student. Somebody does. And having that conversation with the student to figure out who that person might be, it might not be somebody they initially think about. Oh, I didn't realize I could have somebody like that write my recommendation letter. And again, failing an academic one, at least we can get something from somebody who knows something about that student.
I think, too, a lot of times the brag sheets, I think, are good where a student can bring that brag sheet to you. I think there's a missed opportunity in the brag sheet where there could be that opportunity where the student, you could say on the brag sheet, tell me about a time in a classroom that you were very proud of contributing in the class. You know, most of the times it's honors and awards and activities that a student was involved in, and there's not too much academic that the students have to really think and reflect a little bit more about their interaction in the classroom itself. That would be very valuable as well, coming from a teacher or coming from a counselor if you don't know that student. So it's not just activity driven, but it's academic focused as well. That could be helpful.
Okay, so we have a question here. So again, it's kind of similar vein, but if I don't know a student well, and this is someone actually from a private school that's smaller, but just given their caseload and the number of students, if I don't know a student well or as well as some, what's the most important thing, or what are the most important qualities or things to hit on? Bob obviously talks about academic performance or I think specific examples from a class. Anything else to add to that, gentlemen?
I think quizzing the faculty. They know the student, and if you need to get little splices of quotes, I've read many a recommendation letter like that, where there's quotes included from a couple of different teachers, and that really helps. And that could be an easy way to bridge that gap if you don't know the student well. And if it is a smaller private school where you know the faculty maybe more than at a large high school, or even a large high school, you might know the faculty, to just quiz them. Say, you had this student in your class last semester, last year. Can you give me a couple of words about them?
Great, thanks. We have someone, I've been writing counselor recs for 24 years now, and I often feel they're stale and trite. They seem to say the same thing with differing levels of enthusiasm. Do these letters hurt my students? Or I guess the bigger question is, how do I kind of make these letters more effective?
Well, I guess the first response would be, you might have been writing them for 20-some years, but that's the first time we've read it. So it might be old and stale to you. It might not be old and stale to us. Although, to be honest, a lot of the rec letters are fairly similar in style. I think, and it's a hard thing, and it's a frightening thing for you to try to think like an admissions person for a minute. You're reading hundreds and hundreds of applications. You've seen hundreds and hundreds of transcripts, and now this is, it's 9 o'clock at night on a Thursday. You're trying to, round out your reading for the night. What would you want to read at that point? And try to think like us just for a second. And then when you're done, don't think like us ever again. But think about us just for a second. What do you think we would, at that point in time, given that sort of mindset, what would capture our attention? And maybe approach it from that perspective.
All right, great. Now we have a couple questions about students who are, or kind of the dilemma of having to write a letter of recommendation for students that you might not be so enthusiastic about. So asking, is it appropriate to identify growth areas, or let's say there's a student who, there's nothing particularly bad about them, but they might be a little cocky or obnoxious. I know there's not that many high school students that are obnoxious, but or they're lazy and they kind of have their let their parents do all the work for them. I mean, are these things you want to address, or especially for counselors that have to write this letter for the student, what's the most effective way to handle those situations?
Bob, I'll let you take that one first.
Okay. I think there's a point of being honest and being too honest. You never really want to put yourself in jeopardy in case that student for some reason does get that letter of recommendation, and then you potentially have a lawsuit on your hand because the student then says that you were the reason they didn't get admitted because of what you wrote about them. However, I think there's a way to be less enthusiastic without necessarily saying those things about being lazy. You could say things like students in the top, in the top 100 for me in this year. It may not be the top 10. I'm not the top one in your career. Where you're not necessarily saying that they are always the go-getter or the top performer. And we as admission officers can really read between the lines when you say those things. I remember also there were some counselors that would write the letter of recommendation, and then they would also put a comment, please call me to talk further about this student. In many cases, we would call that counselor and we would sort of get that off the record recommendation for the student. And so that's something that you could do as well. So I think, being careful about, I know that for myself, I've had many people that I've worked with over the years, and some are very strong employees, other not so much, and some of those not so much employees will ask me to write a letter of recommendation for them for another job. They had good intentions by all sense of the word, but there were certain things that they just weren't that strong in. And so I would say there are some areas of improvement for this person. We addressed these issues. And so I think you could take a similar approach as well for students without necessarily saying this student is the laziest student I've ever encountered in the last 20 years. You could say something a little bit more creative about that student where it also covers you a little bit more, where you could say this student puts in the effort in the class to earn the grades he does, which may show that that's a C or a B or something like that. Dave?
Student does not lack for self-confidence. How's that for cocky?
I like it.
All right, thanks, guys. So next question: if a counselor or teachers turn in multiple letters of recommendation for students at the same institution, is there a process where those are compared, kind of to see the level of enthusiasm?
I would say not really. However, there are, depending upon how the admission office reads applications. Again, I've worked at 5 different schools, and every place was different as far as how we evaluated the application. But for example, when I was at Stanford, we read by territory. And so I would read every single student from that school. And so I tended to read by school rather than, one school and then read another student from another school, just so I got context for that school. And there would be times where I would say, wait a second, I think I just read that letter of recommendation. And I would go back and look at the other student, and it would be basically the same exact thing. And so that came from teachers, that came from counselors. And so yes and no, depending upon how they're evaluated. Do admission officers, I think when I was at Berkeley and we had 70,000 applications, do you have time to go back and say, okay, I remember this other application I read 900 applications ago to pull that up? It's probably not going to happen. But in the cases where they read by territory or discuss an admissions committee by territory, that could be something that is looked at.
And in terms of where students are applying, is that something for letter writers to consider at all? So if a student's applying to schools that are like the Stanfords, or applying to honors programs or kind of small liberal arts schools where these letters might be read and scrutinized more closely versus a student that's applying to kind of large public state schools, is there anything to kind of consider the effort to put into those?
I would just say I would be careful about generalizing schools. Carolina is not the largest state school in the country, but it's a large state school, and reread all the recommendation letters. So I don't know if I would go into in small liberal arts, they read them, or it matters more. Large schools, it doesn't matter. I would focus more on, is the student a good match for that school? To be honest, schools that require recommendation letters, I just don't know a lot of them out there who don't look at them. I mean, it's a lot of work on the institution's part to require them, collect them, match them up with the application, and then do something with them. So a lot of folks, I don't imagine there's a lot of colleges out there who are going through that headache only to just do that and not ever incorporate that into the decision-making process.
Great point. Thank you. Next question is, what about turning in letters of recommendation after the due date? How does that hurt the student's chances?
So there is the application due date that the student needs to submit their application by. However, that doesn't mean that the letters of recommendation have to be submitted by that same day. Most schools, if the application is not complete, meaning that to have a completed application, at Stanford, for example, we required 2 teacher letters of recommendation and a counselor statement. If we did not receive those by the time the decision was going to be made, or 2 weeks before we actually were going to post decisions, we would actually cancel the application. It would not count that as a completed application. We would definitely let the student know that we were still missing teacher recommendation or a counselor statement, but in most cases we would not give an official decision back to the student. We would decline that application. And so you do have some time. Just because the November 1st deadline is there doesn't mean your letter of recommendation has to be there. It just needs to be there by the time the application starts to be reviewed or before final decisions are going to be posted. And so I can guarantee that the student will know that the letters of recommendation are not there, but then they would in turn go and let you know whether or not they needed additional information. It does take a little bit of time to process all of those things. If you think about a school that gets 20,000 applications or 25,000 applications and requires 2 letters of recommendation, that's 50,000 letters of recommendation that all need to be matched up. And as much as the admissions world wants to go completely digital and everything online, many teachers and counselors still send paper, and so it takes a while to process all of that paper into connecting it directly to the student's application.
Great, thanks, Bob. Next question is it okay for counselors and teachers to use quotes directly from a student's brag sheet? So to quote the student directly, or is it better to take the time and try and restate and craft that into their own words?
I don't know if I have an opinion on that, to be honest. I guess it depends on the quote. And it depends on what point you're trying to prove with it. In and of itself, I don't see that as an issue, using a student's direct quote.
Yeah, I think it's fine.
Okay, great. Can you guys give some specific examples of great recommendation letters from counselors? So can you think of, I'm sure you have plenty that, some that stick out in your minds, but think of ones that were great and why they were memorable?
I think for me in general, it's just really those ones that I can go and tell a story because they're real examples rather than the student has a love of learning to really talk about their engagement in the classroom, engagement outside of the classroom, really add to that student and less more so about the school itself and the counselor's credentials unless it's going to provide additional context about the school. Those types of things in general are the ones that are more memorable for me. I remember one student at Stanford who the counselor recommendation was one that really made me think twice about the decision that I was about to make, and that really moved the student from a denied student to an admitted student who's actually a freshman at Stanford right now. And it really was because the counselor recommendation really was able to address the academic issues that the student had in high school. And the student was not a straight A student, and by the look of it, you would just think that they were not ready. But then because of the teacher and because of the counselor, both of them talked about the student who had been paralyzed at the age of 13, being hit by a car, and what this student had to overcome. And so the student was a little bit more modest in talking about what he had to really overcome. He addressed it, but it didn't really come to the forefront until I read the counselor statement. And actually, I just saw this counselor at the College Board Forum in New York, and she came up and said he's having a great freshman year. He's from a high school in New York City, and so that really just added to the whole big picture, and it was something that enabled me to tell a better story when presented to student in admissions committee.
I don't have specific examples, but I'll give the same advice I give to students when I'm doing these sort of sessions on how to write a college essay. Excuse me. And that is to think about sort of a hypothetical situation where I'm late for a flight and I get to the terminal and my flight is delayed, and I look around and there's an empty seat. And if the empty seat is next to you after reading your essay, and so in this case after reading that recommendation letter, do I want to sit next to you and have a conversation with you, or would I rather walk around the terminal and exercise as opposed to sitting next to you? So that's kind of the way I would say a good recommendation letter would make me want to go sit next to that student and learn more about them.
Awesome, thanks. All right, so we have a few questions left. We have about 10 minutes here, so hopefully we're going to try and get through 5 questions. So if you have a question that you haven't asked yet, please do so. We're going to pick the top 5 questions and try and plow through them here. I have 2 in the queue here. So the first one is, if a college indicates they do not require a letter of recommendation, is it ever appropriate to still send one with the file? And if so, when?
I think the answer to that is really, are they going to evaluate it or not? So is it they don't require it? If they highly recommend, that means they require it. And any other letter of support, for example, at Berkeley, if you were to send in a letter of recommendation, it would go to no one. It would never be evaluated unless they asked the student for that letter of recommendation. So finding out about their policies is something that would be in your best interest, whether or not to put forward the effort.
I would think most admissions offices would be honest with you to tell you, yeah, send it in, it's not going to go anywhere. Or, yeah, send it in, we'll make sure it gets to the person. I think they'll be upfront with you.
Okay, great. Next question, the Common App obviously covers a wide range of colleges with varying selectivity. If I have a student who I feel is a good fit for college X that they're applying for on the Common App and not college Y, even though they're using the same recommendation letter, how do I approach that? Do I still write the same kind of glowing letter of recommendation I would write for one college? Or I guess the bigger question again is, should counselors or should teachers vary the recommendation letter by college based on whether they think the student's a good fit or not?
I mean, I don't necessarily know that you should call out the school's name in that letter of recommendation, but frame the conversation and what you write about that one particular school that you think is a better fit for that student if you're a counselor. So I wouldn't call, that way you don't call out a school. And the one thing that really concerns me about the state of college admissions that we're in now is the use of demonstrated interest in the review process. And so many of you know what that is, the student engaging with the university, how much effort they put into the search process, how they're connecting with the schools. It's something that a lot of schools are using to determine whether or not if they admit this student, will they actually enroll. And so as school moves into the demonstrated interest piece, if you're going to say, hey, I think this student is a great fit for Rhodes College, and the student is looking and saying that they want to go to Elon University, would they use that to say, well, I think this student would really probably go to Elon versus Rhodes or Rhodes versus Elon. I may not admit that student, or maybe I'll defer them and see what happens. So I wouldn't necessarily mention the school, particularly in the Common App. Now, if you're writing for another institution that does not accept Common App or some other form of the application, maybe at that time you can change that letter and you can send it to multiple places. But if you're using the Common App with one letter of recommendation or one letter of support, then I would keep it generic with the school, but really sort of frame your conversation to what you think is the better fit.
All right, thanks, Bob. Well, it looks like that's it for questions. So thank you, everyone, for attending. As David referenced earlier, we had over 150 people on here. So Really appreciate the spirited questions and dialogue, and thank you to our presenters, David and Bob, for some really good information. We will be sending out a follow-up to everyone, and hopefully we will have a recording of this presentation attached, so you can watch it again. You can share it with other teachers or counselors who you think would benefit from it. And everyone have a great rest of your day and enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.